We have a very special episode today on the Brisbane Property Podcast where we are joined by Kaushiv Charan from FloodSmart Engineering, who consults with DRW Consulting. And Kaushiv is going to highlight some of the reasons why Brisbane's flood maps have recently been updated. This is an episode not to be missed.
Welcome to the Brisbane Property Podcast with your hosts Melinda and Scott Jennison.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast with Scott and Melinda Jennison. And we've got an interesting topic today. We've brought in someone that definitely knows a lot more about this side of things than us. We've got Kaushiv Charan from FloodSmart Engineering. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that was pretty good.
Perfect. Now, you also do some consulting from a company we know quite well, DRW Consulting. And today's an interesting topic, as I mentioned, because, we are a flood city, Brisbane, and surrounding areas. And your job is basically doing flood modelling. So I think you'll be able to teach our listeners quite a bit in this episode.
Yes, welcome, Kaushiv. We're really excited to have you on the podcast. Now, the reason that we decided to invite a specialist in flood mapping in for this podcast episode is because, as you will all be aware, Brisbane has recently updated a lot of its flood maps. Homes that were not previously in flood impacted zones now appear in those flood maps and vice versa. So there's actually been a shift in those models. And Kaushiv's very much involved in the modelling that is supplied to the Brisbane City Council, which they can then use to inform residents about the flood risk. So first of all, obviously, we know that there's been some significant floods here in Brisbane within the last 10 years. Of course, the floods of 2011 and more recently in 2022. Two quite different types of floods. Would you agree, Kaushiv? Can you just step us through those two flood events?
Yeah, so firstly, thanks for having me. And yes, they are very different flood events. 2011, obviously more river-based, water coming from the dams into the main rivers. And 2022 was intense rainfall, so direct rainfall going to creeks and overland flow paths.
So what we saw in 2011 was the banks of the Brisbane River actually broke, and we saw a lot of that water spill into surrounding suburbs, whereas in 2022, we saw that intense rainfall, an overland flow flooding event, some creeks and waterways swelling, but not as much impact from the river. And of course, there's three different types of flooding that we often talk about in this podcast, being that river flooding, and then there's that creek and waterway flooding and overland flow flooding. So we're going to take a deep dive into all of those different types of flooding events in today's episode as well.
Now, I'll give away a bit of my age, but if we go back to the 74 floods, which I think historically people do talk about the 74 floods, then they built Wivenhoe Dam. That was going to stop the floods. But then 2011 happened, as you said. That was the overflow. Wivenhoe Dam obviously built up a lot of water, and they had to release a lot of the water, which obviously contributed to that flooding back in 2011. That's correct?
Yep, that's correct, yeah.
So what got you into this? Obviously flood modelling, it's probably a pretty intense thing to look at when you look at it from a research side of things, but what got you into flood modelling?
I noticed there was a lot of urban development in Brisbane and southeast Queensland, and I think flooding governs a lot of development nowadays. It's something you look at the beginning of a project, so it seemed like a fun way to jump into urban planning and development and sort of being able to direct the strategy that you would approach a site with.
What's really interesting, Kaushiv, is the change in the way Brisbane has been built out across the city since the pre-war era. And we talk about the mapping that we see on Brisbane City Council websites, where we can see aerial photography from 1946, which shows how many character Queenslander homes were built in specific locations at that time. And then we can compare that with the more recent aerial photography in how that urban spread has occurred. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the flood impacted land is the land that's actually been developed in more recent years, whereas back prior to 1946, most of the land that was that flood impacted land was left as floodplains. So obviously there's a lot more guidance, engineering, structural change that needs to go into planning to build on flood prone land. Can you share a little bit about, the difference, why we might have seen this shift to now develop this flood impacted land?
Yeah, so as you said, there's a lot of urban areas that are now flood affected. Obviously, there's a demand for housing and whatnot and development. So we do need to develop in flood areas to maximize. And by we, that could be residential or property developers and whatnot. So the reason you also see more flooding in development areas is because they are designed to flood in a certain way. So you may have a car park and that can allow for certain flooding. But obviously, if you have a childcare center, you don't want any flooding, and you'll see that's completely flood-free. So there's a bit of a difference there.
When you look at this, and this is a bit for our listeners that probably don't know a huge amount about when it comes to flooding, and because we've got, as we've mentioned, the overland flow of creek flooding, river flooding, those types of things. There's different events that you look at. So there's the 1 in 50 year, 1 in 100 year, those types of things. Can you explain a little bit what that means to our listeners?
Yeah, correct. So in Brisbane, generally, when you're looking at overland flow, you're looking at the 1 in 50-year event. So what that means is theoretically, every 50 years, this event would occur once. It's also known as a 2% AEP event, which means in any given year, it has a 2% chance of occurring.
It's interesting because I know we've spoken previously about flood-wise reports, and for listeners that want more information about what a flood-wise report is, we have a fantastic resource on our website in our blogs all about Brisbane flooding. So you can head to streamlinepropertybuyers.com.au/blogs and search up flood, and you'll get all of the links to many of the flood mapping resources. But one of those resources is called that flood-wise property report, and it's quite a technical report typically for property developers, but it does outline that 1 in 50 year event, or that 2% AEP flood event. So people can actually look up to see whether their property on a per property basis may be impacted. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the flood-wise property report will show you whether you're affected by river flooding, creek flooding, or overland flow. It also sometimes shows you the tidal effects if you're near a bay of some sort.
Okay. So coastal impacts from storm surge and things like that.
Yeah, that's correct. So that would be the place to start. And then from there, you can go to Brisbane City Council's interactive mapping, which shows the overlays from an aerial point of view, just to give you a better indication of where the flooding occurs.
Perfect. And what about a 1 in 100 year event? How does that differ to a 1 in 50 year event?
Yeah, so it's generally a bigger magnitude. The 1 in 100 year event is more applicable to creek flooding and river flooding.
Yep.
So again, it's a event that theoretically happens once 100 years. And it's also known as a 1% AEP event. So theoretically, it has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year.
So if people obviously are looking to buy a property, or in fact they already own a property, and they're wanting to do some renovations, improvements, or development on the side, and they look up that floodwise report and see that there is some sort of flood impact, you are the sort of person then that they would need to approach to understand the extent of the impact on that side. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Usually engage a consultant and get some preliminary information. If you find that the flooding is manageable and there's not really any reporting needed, that's a pretty good scenario. But if you find that there's further assessment required, you can further engage a consultant and they can guide you through the process.
And when you do the consulting, so for us, again, just for the listeners that don't know a lot about this, we can look at a flood map and say, look, the area's got a little bit of overland flow near it, or it could be in a buffer of a flood area. How does the modelling work? So if someone was to look, and you look at it, you probably look at it very different to a lot of other people. How does the modelling actually work? How do you do the modelling to understand heights? I mean, do you look at heights of the water, all those types of things, depth?
Yeah, so I guess you'd separate it into two parts. The first is hydrology. So how much water is actually going through the site. So what we do is we draw a catchment. So it's basically all the areas that contribute runoff towards your site. And we find the peak discharge rate. So, for example, it might be 5,000 litres per second. It could be 200 litres per second. So how much water is going towards the site? The second part is the hydraulics part. So what we utilize is LiDAR data, which is basically ground contours that have been produced from above ground laser drones, if you may.
Yep.
And we put in blockages within the area. So if there's a house or an apartment blocking water, we put those blockages in. Sometimes we put in the underground network, so stormwater pits and pipes that you find in council's roads.
Yep.
Obviously, there's a lot more, but basically you build a model, you put the water in it, and you see where it's going. And upon that, you get your water levels and your water depths.
Does it help with the discharge rate then, when you look at that? So obviously the water coming in, if I look at a house, for example, and I've got a roof of a house, and I know that when hydraulic engineers design these type of things, they'll look at the amount of downpipes they need to put on the house to get that water away from the house. Is it a similar style to that, but just in a bigger scale?
Yeah, that's correct. Roof water is more to do with local stormwater management,
Yep.
whereas flooding is more of a regional or local/regional phenomenon.
Yeah. Yep.
So you're looking more at the topography of the local land.
So there's a lot of engineering, a lot of mathematics, a lot of, equations that go into modeling this out. For those that may not be familiar or have never seen a report that's produced by a hydraulics engineer, they can be very complex. But ultimately, what they're trying to show is what is the extent of impact on a particular site, and is that water moving quickly or is it moving slowly over that site? Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, that's correct. I usually break it into two parts. The first being, as you said, a flood impact assessment. If you're building a new house on a block, where's that water going? Are we affecting neighbors? That's the first part. And the second part is usually the floor levels. What level can you put your garage at? What level can you put the dwelling at?
So minimum habitable floor levels. And I know that those FloodWise reports that we referenced earlier will always state what those minimum habitable floor levels need to be or should be on a site. And that's one way to check whether the property that might exist on a site, especially if you're looking to buy, whether that has been approved to be at a higher level than that minimum habitable floor level. There's some complex words in there. I feel like I'm getting my tongue tied. A quick question before we discuss the changes that have occurred more recently. How do you feel that the urban development, the footprint that we have created over the past 40 to 50 years has impacted the flood levels in nearby locations? Has it had an impact in shifting flood water from one area to another?
So I'd say I don't have that many years on me, so I'm not too aware what happened back in the day, but I can say that I think generally water nowadays is being pushed towards waterways and designated creeks or channels.
Yep.
So it's more channelized. The idea is to have it less widespread and put back into the creeks or rivers so that people are safe.
Got it.
We did a podcast a while ago now with Dr. Mary Margaret, sorry. I can't remember Margaret's last name. I should do, but it was interesting talking about the flooding and concrete compared to grass, for example. Just in our area nearby where we live, they've actually taken away about 8 houses and turned them into parkland, and obviously to allow that water to flow away as well. So the flood mapping, so with some changes that we've seen with Brisbane mapping, and we have noticed this recently where they've updated, and it seems to be a bit wider, I guess. What's prompted those sort of changes, do you think?
Yeah, so with the recent 2022 February events, council is more, I guess, on edge, you could say.
Yep.
And they've been more active in updating their flood mapping. So there's no real public information that can directly point us to exactly why the flood mapping is more significant or has a bigger magnitude, but I would assume that it's mostly climate change factors. Other councils like Logan City Council, actually, in the last few years, their flood levels in their creeks have gone up 3 to 5 meters.
Really?
Wow.
So just a significant change across the whole council. I think Brisbane's been a bit more discreet in that. You might catch it, you might not. But I would say it's climate change factors.
It's really interesting because obviously, you're providing a lot of the flood modelling reports that get sent into council, and then off the back of that, not only are they considering what's happening now, but they're potentially, based on what you've said, predicting what could happen in the future. So for people that, previously might have been sitting on the edge of flood maps, but now they're sitting in them, it may not necessarily mean that site's been impacted in the past, but it's almost predicting that there's the potential or the possibility that it could be impacted in the future based on climate change. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So obviously there's implications for property owners or property buyers if a home appears in a flood map. And I know insurance is not your area of expertise, Kaushiv, but it is something that we will always outline to our buyers as well. If a property is going to be sitting in a flood mapping zone, then potentially that can impact on the insurance premiums that you may have to pay. And we would always recommend that part of any due diligence process in selecting a property to buy involves obtaining an insurance quote. It might not be that you're in the flood zone, but it might be that you're nearby, and therefore understanding how that flood mapping change could impact on the cost of insurance becomes a critical part of that due diligence that you should be doing when selecting an asset to buy, whether that's a home or an investment. So definitely something that should be considered.
Yeah, I think that's where it comes down to people. If you're looking to buy a property, you need to know, one, if it's in a zone now, or if it's close to it. I mean, I guess in the future that could change again. I mean, they've changed it now. As you said, it's 3 to 4 meters in Logan area. That's a massive amount of change when you look at someone that might have bought in an area that's fairly close to that buffer, whereas now they're probably in a complete flood zone.
Yeah, it's quite drastic.
Yeah.
In fact, quite recently, so there's a thing called Australian Rainfall and Runoff, which is almost like a guideline for rainfall intensities in flood modelling. And they've recently come out with further climate change factors to consider. So it's a matter of question now when Brisbane City Council will adopt these new guidelines. So I would estimate maybe 6 months to a year. Obviously, that's just an estimation, but there's potential that these flood levels go up further.
Yeah, that's a good tip.
That is a great tip. So again, it becomes even more critical to understand where you're buying and understand those flood maps and what they mean to you. Obviously, there's different types of flood zones, as we've pointed out. Do you feel, based on your experience for a property owner, that there's more risk for one type of flooding compared to another? And if so, what would be your reasoning around that?
Yeah, so generally I would say creek and river flooding because it's more a backwater effect. So what that means is it's rising from the banks, it's breaking the banks, as you said it did in 2011.
Yep.
It's a slower moving water because it's rising. It has close to zero velocity mostly.
Yep.
So what you can do to mitigate that is whatever you fill, you want to cut an equal amount. But overland flow is more conveyance based. It's coming down a hill, it's got velocity. So if you put a new development in the way, it's going to hit that house, it's going to go to the neighbors. There's a lot of issues there. And I find that to be a more complex matter to mitigate.
It's a good thing to understand. I know when we're outlining, overland flow paths to people, explaining that level of risk, you've done it in a really good way, and I'm going to hijack those words that you've used to help educate our clients in the future, because it's the velocity of the speed of the water that can have a higher level of impact. Whereas creek or river flooding, obviously the water rises and falls away much slower, and it's not moving at such a high intensity. So it's that high runoff. And think Brisbane, we have so many storms where we have such intense rainfall in such a short amount of time. And this is what can contribute to those overland flow events. And certainly was the flood event more recently, where it didn't stop raining for 3 days. It was a rain bomb, as they described it, but it was the velocity of the water that was coming down that caused, the damage and the concern.
Yeah. So if you look at the mapping to reality, so what's the difference? If you were to say, you had a flood risk in Brisbane for the current mapping compared to the reality, I mean, what sort of buyers, what sort of things should they be looking at when they're making a decision?
Yeah, so I run into this all the time. Clients say, I've never really seen this flooding extent. I've lived here 50 years, and I'm like, I understand that, but these are sort of council's rules and policies that we have to go by. But yes, there are limitations to flood modeling. So there's things like we won't model fences. Um, we can't model block drains. We have to model a functional stormwater drainage system. In reality, if you go to a drain, it might be half blocked, it might be fully blocked. So water's going to different places in reality. Someone might develop something illegally. There's trees blocking different things. There's a lot of factors that go into it. I would say half and half in my experience. I have gone to sites where they said, I've never seen any flooding, and my model showed flooding all over the site.
Yeah.
I've also gone to other sites where they said that's bang on. That's same depths, same area. It looks exactly like what happened.
And have you ever had situations where it's flooded, but it's not been picked up in your modelling, which is the third scenario?
Sorry, it's flooded, but it hasn't been picked up.
Yes.
I haven't really had that issue too much.
Okay. Well, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
So basically, if there's a flood risk, it's likely to be picked up. But the scenario is it's either more a real flood risk or a potential flood risk that has not yet eventuated, more so than property doesn't sit in a flood map, but actually has had some flooding in the past.
Yeah, correct.
Makes sense.
It's interesting the amount of times that we've heard people say, oh, it's never flooded before. And yet it is probably in a flood zone or in a buffer. The one thing I just noticed when you touched on then, which probably, I mean, people probably don't think about it so much, is taking into account the things that are unknown. So you're modeling things, and all of these flood mapping is based off a system that it's actually working correctly.
Yeah. So if I just revise that a little, we do allow for some blockages, but we can't fully estimate all the blockages in the local area.
Exactly, which you can't.
Yeah.
So, if you get heavy storms, which we do in Brisbane, we get some really, really heavy storms with wind. And if they're blowing, as you said, trees, branches, leaves, and the gutter system is, stormwater system's getting blocked, they're the sort of things that are really hard to take into account when you get those sort of heavy storms.
So in terms of practical advice then, what should buyers be looking for when they're investigating properties in flood-prone areas?
Yeah, so if you're looking in a flood-prone area, as you mentioned, the interactive mapping from Brisbane City Council, the Floodwise report. There's also a flood awareness report. Council has also released a new community map, which is an online map that shows stormwater infrastructure. If you're curious to how much drainage is in the area, or maybe it just provides a good indication of whether maybe all the flood is just ponding there, or if it's able to escape and go elsewhere. More practical hands-on advice when you're doing property inspections, I'd look at the soil. Is it moist and still saturated on a sunny day?
Yep.
That's a big no-no.
Telltale sign.
Yeah. Obvious things like water lines along retaining walls or the building walls. Also, just looking at the local topography. So if both of your neighbors are up high and you're down low, there's a good chance that the water naturally falls onto your property, and therefore you may be in the local depression where all the water would go through.
Good tips.
A really simple one, and I mean, I'll throw it anyway. I know the answer, but you're looking at a property, and on the road outside of the street, outside the property, is an overland flow path. Okay, down through the street. Is that a problem for a potential buyer, or do you check the stormwater system to see that there's drainage out there?
Yeah, so it is a potential problem. It depends on the road. Some roads are more designed better to facilitate the overland flow. But if you have a very flat road, there's a good chance that it breaks over the curb and goes down into the property.
So check the contours around the area, your contours, to make sure it's higher than the road as well.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, that's good advice. So if we talk about, future modelling and predictions for, what things could look like in the future here in Brisbane, do you expect flood mapping to continue to evolve in the future?
I do. I think there may be more regional models that model regional areas as a whole in the future. But with overland flow, because it's so site specific, I feel like there will always be site specific specific modeling for those properties.
And actually, one thing to note in relation to that overland flow is at the moment, council cannot provide details on a site-specific basis in terms of the depth or the velocity of an overland flow path. Whereas for creek and waterway flooding, typically you've got a much better indication of how deep that flood impact is likely to be. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. River and creeks, they'll always provide flood levels. There's a few circumstances where they might not have the data, but more than often they have it. Overland flow, they'll never provide you flood velocities or flood depths and flood levels. So that's where you go to a hydraulic consultant and you get a flood model done.
So for a property buyer, if they're seeing an overland flow path through a property, obviously they identify that that's a potential risk. There's no other way for them to understand the impact of that risk other than engaging a hydraulic engineer. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. But if just some quick advice, I guess, if you have a property with overland flow going through it and you have a slab on ground dwelling, so that dwelling's in the middle of the flow path already blocking water. If you're looking to develop, you're probably looking at a similar footprint dwelling. So essentially you're taking the old dwelling out, putting in a new one, but it's blocking the same amount of water. If you're looking to do something like that, you should be all right. The only thing to consider is floor levels, which will usually go up.
Yeah, because the water level comes, so you need to make it obviously immune to that water.
Yeah, correct. There's a thing called freeboard, which is just a contingency to ensure that in larger events, you're still not impacted.
What if you had a character Queenslander home built up on stilts with no slab on ground, and you've purchased in an overland flow path and your intent was to lift and build in under? How does sort of council see that scenario?
Yeah, so that's a tricky scenario. Just from what you've told me, I would say steer away from that because you're looking at an open block and now you're blocking it with a slab on ground structure. Water's going to go everywhere. It's going to impact the neighbours.
So obviously you need to know what you're looking for and understand the due diligence that's required up front before you commit to a purchase of some of these sites, especially if you are looking to add value or renovate or even develop any of these types of properties.
Yeah, that's correct.
Obviously, then when we grow and we're talking about urban planning, I mean, this would be a lot that you'd probably have a lot to do with when it comes to the modelling to avoid planning to sort of avoid disasters for flooding. That's something you have a lot to do with when it comes to designing those sort of areas.
Yeah, that's correct. So when we do these flood models, the impacts that are created from those proposed developments, we ensure that it never affects any neighbouring infrastructure or any neighbouring properties, so that in the future, if it were to go to a larger magnitude, it wouldn't be that significant.
Yeah, that's good. Look, there's been a lot of amazing sort of takeaways for listeners in this podcast, and I'm really grateful that you've been able to come in today, Kaushiv, and share this information. But for listeners who have tuned in today, if they want to learn more about flood modelling, explore the updated maps, obviously you've outlined where they can go for further information, and we will include those links for council websites in the show notes. But if people want to get in touch with yourself, how can they do that?
Yeah, so at my website, floodsmarteng.com.au is my website. Email and contact information is on there. As we mentioned earlier, Dave from DRW Consulting also sent me, who does a lot of civil works, also stormwater management and flooding as well. So DRW is another website that you could visit.
Perfect. And what we're going to do for listeners is put that information in the show notes. Please respect the professional capacity that Kaushiv has. He's not going to respond individually to inquiries about whether your property sits in a flood mapping zone. But if you are looking to develop or significantly renovate residential property that may be in or near flood zones, that would be the reason to reach out and seek further guidance, because that's when you may need the expertise of the hydraulic engineering team. Yeah,
I think if there's any developers out there looking at property that might have any type of impact or be in any sort of risk at all, I definitely highly recommend getting a team. I always talk about having the right people to work with you when you're doing these sort of things. So as you mentioned, Dave from DRW Consulting and obviously the guys at FloodSmart Engineering. would be someone that I'd probably suggest having a talk to and consulting them to get the right advice to steer you in the right direction. So, mate, look, thanks very much for joining us today. Some good insight and some good information there for our listeners. Hopefully that's been great information for everyone. Really appreciate you coming in for a chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate being on a podcast like this.
Thank you. And as usual, I will let Melinda wrap it up for another week from the Brisbane Property Podcast. And from myself, take care. We'll talk again next week. Thanks very much for listening, and bye for now.
Yes, thanks again, Kaushiv. We're very grateful for the contributions that you've made to this episode. As always, if you have enjoyed this episode, particularly if you know friends, family, or others who may be living in or near a flood impacted location or looking to buy property and not sure of how to navigate properties and flood maps, please share this episode with them. There's lots of useful resources that will be in the show notes as well. So we hope that you find value in that information also. We'd love for you to leave us a review as always. But until next week, bye for now.